trickle in throughout the event, so let's get going. It's 3:30 in San Francisco, it's 6:30 in New York, 9:30 a.m. on Friday morning here in Melbourne, Australia. Welcome to the Supply Chain Bunker. We're going to start with a few headlines of what I'm seeing and what I've been seeing in the last week in the industry, and then we're going to chat with Dave. We've got some really good guests today, and we'll be introducing you to Lorraine Marchand, who is a life science and healthcare supply chain specialist, and Greg Schulte, who is the director of engineering at Mindtribe, which is part of Accenture. We'll come to those in a short while, and healthcare supply chain and that area is going to be a key part of what we're talking today. Yeah. Over the last week, I have talked to numerous people, and last night I spent an interesting hour talking to a CEO of a large contract manufacturer with a really substantial footprint in China. Good news from that side is they're back to well over 90% capacity, and we're seeing that kind of trend throughout China. And it's interesting. I don't think we have enough data to say that other countries are following specific trends. That's going to be something that we have to develop over the coming weeks in terms of modeling. But seeing them back on production. I spoke to a capital equipment company in South Korea. They're back up to full production now. So there are some encouraging signs. What those companies are seeing now is a next wave of disruption, and that's a demand side disruption. So I think we're in this strange situation of multiple impacts right now. The third disruption impacting companies, and a lot of companies talking about, and a lot of coverage in the media, is how they deal with workplace practices, particularly around social distancing. That's providing lots of challenges, and companies with more automation are perhaps doing a little bit better there, but we're seeing some interesting examples around that. One of the biggest debates that's been raging this week, and it's been quite animated between some people, is the manufacturing industry's ability to stand up new products, and particularly to build things like ventilators. Pivoting supply chains seems to be the order, and pivoting manufacturing seems to be the order of the day. Backing that up, we have the Defense Production Act in the US and the way that's being applied, and I think that's very important, and I know we're going to get to that a little bit today. Another big challenge exists around this process is how supply and demand are connected. And I think there's some real frustration there. I interviewed a consultant in Europe a couple of days ago that's very connected to that EMS industry. And he's getting calls from EMS guys that say, we have production available, we're ready to make stuff, but how do we connect with the demand end of the supply chain? So there's a requirement there. And it's figuring out how administrations connect the dots in this situation, and where people like trade associations get involved. So I think there's some really interesting things happening there. We're seeing more and more makers and engineers bringing solutions, and that's interesting. And I know Dave had some comments on that, because I think there's a role for innovation and creativity, and it's really important, but we need products that are fit for purpose, safe for use. Even with regulations being loosened, we still need products that are safe and important. Life remains very unpredictable in terms of the urgent, in terms of the midterm, and in terms of the long term. So we don't know what life after COVID-19 is going to look like. One of the trends that I've seen this week in the news is remote and robotic solutions. I think there's a really interesting trend there being explored by numerous companies, numerous applications like monitoring areas using drones to make sure people are social distancing, remote medicine, sterilization, cleaning, and we'll get into those a little bit later as well. And as always in the bunker, we're not going to hit the big numbers, but suffice to say, they're pretty alarming at the moment, with cases identified getting past that 1 million mark. There are some shocking numbers there. And I think what's most concerning for a lot of us is the trends are still unclear. We don't know where we are in this process. So I think that whole unpredictability is challenging us. That's all I've got in terms of news today. But Dave, I'd love to hear what you've seen. You've been buried this week. You've been a busy guy.
Yeah, but I think that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about our customers and really what's going on from a supply chain perspective, and continuing this conversation of looking at both the large macro, so looking at, you know, what are some of the large indexes saying around manufacturing, as well as talking to some of the individuals. I think the other place where I've spent my time this last week, and I'll share back some stats, is looking at other force majeure situations where there's been large disruptions. And so I was reading an article, which I'll share a quick snippet from HBR, that reviewed the tsunami that happened in Japan in 2011. And this article referenced, and we can share it in the Slack, or in the everything Slack now, in the chat room later. But it said that executives of a Japanese semiconductor manufacturer told this study that it took a team of 100 people more than an entire calendar year to map that company's supply chain networks deep into sub-tiers following the earthquake and tsunami. And so, you know, this was almost a decade ago, and it made me think a lot around what has changed in supply chain over the last 10 years. If it took 100 man hours or 100 man years to be able to map one company, semiconductor supply chain, what's it going to take this time? And this is on a global scale. So that made me really think a lot. And there's a few other studies like that.
One of the things that fascinates me about that, Dave, is this idea of previous experience and what we learn from previous experience. When I spoke to this particular CEO of the contract manufacturer, he was in Hong Kong, and he was talking about the fact that he was going out to dinner that evening, and although there was social distancing, things were getting back to a degree of normality. And one of the things he saw as one of Asia's advantages was the amount of learning they did during SARS. So SARS was much worse there than it was anywhere in the world. So when his wife phoned him and said, "Are you flying back to Hong Kong tonight? Put a face mask on," he just put a face mask on right away. When people said, "Stay in your homes," everybody stayed in their homes right away. So I think different experiences are informing different parts of this process. And I think that's really key.
And I think that that's why what I've been doing is studying past examples. And in the bunker, I wanted to share that tip with folks because, you know, history tends to repeat itself. And while a tsunami and an earthquake is different than what we're seeing in the pandemic, we can study in different history lessons. You know, we talked around this a little bit in episode 1 on looking at preparedness and how that helps it. So I thought that was interesting to share. The second one is we've seen automotive in the news a lot lately. And actually the CEO of Volkswagen Group came out just this week and said they're burning $2.2 billion a week right now in cash. If you just think about that, because they're only selling vehicles in China. Everywhere else, vehicle sales are essentially down. And so that these automotive industries, and Volkswagen's being very vocal, are looking for new ways to make money. And so again, looking back at trends, we can go to World War II and say, how did automotive, where people weren't buying cars and they moved to actually making tanks and making planes and engines. And so it's no surprise that we're seeing a similar trend of large industry, I think, looking to make medical devices, because we know that that will be a resilient industry throughout this entire pandemic and the waves that come afterwards. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's another interesting trend there. And when you look at automotive specifically, automotive's been on the precipice of disruption for a while. And every time you go to CES, automotive is a much bigger factor there, and tech in automotive. But you've seen companies like Ford with the new CEO pivot towards a smart city kind of solution and that different kind of mobility. So they've already been starting that debate. It's not all about making pickup trucks anymore. So there's a requirement for that. And like you say, there's this urgent requirement to do something now, but it will become an important requirement further down the line.
Yeah. I think something similar that we're tracking as well is looking at the manufacturing ISM or some of these different indexes like new order components, as well as looking at this index called supply delivery time. And how these are changing across the US. You know, last week, over the weekend, we saw China actually close their walls to people being able to fly in. And this is a trend that I think will cause a lot of reshoring in the United States in the years to come. So tracking some of these indexes and how they move from February to March. So if you look at the ISM index, it decreased by about a point from February to March. And if you look also at the supply delivery time, that increased as well. So we're seeing capacity constraints in these large indexes change across the board. And I think agility continues to be a theme. But I think thinking about what does the United States look like post-COVID, how is medical as an industry going to continue to grow and disrupt, and how will other industries like automotive actually shift to where there's still more consumption or growth from an industry perspective. These are trends, and I think, you know, breeds into what we're going to talk about in the medical space. For sure.
Yeah, and I think they're huge trends, and I'd add to that agility the word digital. So I think we've got to go into a stage of digital agility, because our old style agility, which was me jumping on a plane and coming and shooting a piece of video with you guys in San Francisco, that's gone at the moment. And when it comes back, it'll come back differently. In China, you know, if you fly into China to do a trade show, you've got to get there 2 weeks early and spend 2 weeks sat in a hotel room. That's going to stop a lot of people going, even if that show's on. So there's big changes and disruptions. I wanted to ask you about one of your own internal projects before we bring in guests, and we'll try and do this pretty quickly in the next 2 or 3 minutes. But you've got Project Shield, which I started to read about the last couple of days. Really interesting. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so it's awesome. So we've had just a huge number of inbound requests come in for PPE specifically. And what we've seen in the news is that everyone is 3D printing, specifically face shields. I think 3D printing is great, don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of challenges, what we talked in episode 2 around design standards, making sure that they were safe for our medical professionals, and really at the volume and scale that the world needs. So what we've launched internally, and actually we already have product in customers' hands across different hospitals in the US, is that we are launching basically the ability to buy face shields in bulk. So 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 face shields. We're making over 1,000 of these a day, which compared to a lot of 3D printing folks are saying 1,000 in a week or a month. And so we're really targeting high volume. I think the second thing that we did is we've looked at all the open source designs that people were printing, and I'd say we put a professional twist on them. We redesigned these products to meet both the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health Standard, as well as ANSYS, which is the American National Standard Institute, to make sure that they complied with our medical standards, so health professionals around the world could use these. We also did a lot of work to remove and reduce weight of these, because a lot of the printed ones are quite heavy actually. And if you think about a medical worker having to wear this all day, we were able to reduce the weight to under 50 grams, which is huge to be able to wear this on your face all day. So that project goes live tomorrow. We're really trying to help spread the word. And so for any of the audience here, please post. It's non-profit. All profits go back to the WHO, the World Health Organization, to help frontline workers do their jobs better. And this is really to protect our most valuable assets in a time of need, which is our healthcare professionals.
Yeah, and it's huge. And I think what I'd like to be able to do is, touch base again on this next week and see what the response has been, because I think that's really important. But I think it's a great example, and I think we'll see other examples. If it's okay with you, Dave, I'd like to bring in the guests.
Let's bring them in.
Let's bring in some guests. Yeah, I'd like to bring in Lorraine Marchand and have Lorraine just introduce herself. But what I want to talk about, Lorraine, once you've done that introduction, is what you're seeing in terms of those big trends, what you're seeing from the government in terms of regulation, and what you're seeing from the industry in terms of disruption. Lorraine, thanks so much for being here.
Yes, well, thank you, Phil and Dave. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about an important topic, and clearly one that's on all of our minds as we grapple with all facets of this crisis. So I'm Lorraine Marchand, and I'm a healthcare business leader specializing in pharmaceuticals and medical technologies. I've held senior roles in public and privately held companies, including global R&D at Bristol-Myers Squibb, Cognizant Technologies, Covance, IQVIA. But I also know the world of early stage companies, having co-founded medical technology companies. And I consider myself a growth accelerator. I'm always looking for innovative ideas and the ability to help entrepreneurs accelerate the development and commercialization of their innovations. And I've helped a number of companies break into the healthcare space. And then finally, I do teach healthcare at Columbia Business School, and I'm on the advisory board there. And I also teach biotech entrepreneurship at Yeshiva University in New York.
Wow.
So lucky to have you.
Thank you. How did you find time? That's a busy schedule.
They say about giving a job to a busy person.
Yeah. So Lorraine, give us a quick overview of what you're seeing at the moment. I mean, you must be bombarded by information.
Yes, yeah, and Phil, you know, I guess one thing I just wanted to comment before we get into the business discussion is I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the faces of the people that are the victims of this crisis. Yeah. You know, the patients, the healthcare providers that are on the front lines. You know, we just topped 1,000 deaths in the U.S. yesterday. So, you know, clearly our thoughts go out to the humanitarian.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was really fabulous, Dave, to hear you talk about the WHO project and how those monies are going for good. So really, really, that's wonderful. Great, great story that you just shared. So I thought what I would do with our time today is share insights for manufacturers who are looking to navigate the healthcare and med tech supply chain, who want to better understand the implications of COVID-19 policy changes as well as economic disruptions. And so I'd like to focus on 3 areas for today's panel discussion. You know, first, we've got this double-sided shockwave to the supply chain, and it's having an impact on demand and supply in healthcare and on large manufacturers. 2, we've got policy changes from the FDA as well as Congress that are impacting the supply chain now, and they're going to have ramifications in the future. And I know we want to be able to talk about what the future state's going to look like, and there are definitely policies underway now that are going to impact that. And then third, at a federal level, we're also seeing mandates to address gaps in healthcare delivery and stimulate production and very specific types of production to bring much needed supplies and equipment into the healthcare system. So if it's okay with the 2 of you, I thought we'd hit those three trends.
Yep.
I'm excited to learn, so please take it away.
All right, so if we start with the shock wave, I have my map here, and I know that we're all aware that the virus started in China. From a med tech perspective, it really focused on 4 key provinces where the majority of med tech products are manufactured. These are class 2 and class 3 devices, and they represent a little over 11,000 products. Wow. So as we all have experienced, you know, the first quarter shock was when we had the virus start in China with major impact to manufacturing in the supply chain.
And just so I understand, Lorraine, you're saying that 11,000 different products were made just in those couple regions in China?
Yeah, a little bit over 11,000, if you could call them, you know, devices, exactly. 11,000 products, class 2 and class 3, come out of 4 provinces in China, all of which were impacted by the virus.
So it's constrained almost from day 1 due to where the outbreak started.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And then as we saw the virus migrate, you know, of course, across all of Europe, and sort of, you know, hubs, medtech hubs like Germany, for example, and then as it crossed across the Atlantic into North America, into the US, Massachusetts, San Francisco, down into Mexico, in Q2, we started shock number 2, right, which has put a lot of these other manufacturers on their back foot. So these are the 2 waves that we've seen. Obviously, they've got big ramifications. And, you know, unfortunately, we're not done because we're now starting to face the winter months for the Southern Hemisphere. And so now we're expecting to have protracted health and economic disruption across South America, you know, across Australia and across the Southern Hemisphere. So that remains to be seen. And hopefully a lot of what we're doing today will be able to help those countries, you know, in the ensuing few months. So when we think about those waves, we can also take a look at the kind of the 2-pronged impact on the supply chain that this has had. So one is, and you talked about it in your opening remarks, is this urgent demand that we're now seeing for personal protective equipment. We call that PPE. So the gowns, the masks. We're also seeing, you can't, pick up a paper without understanding that we've got this demand for respirators, for ventilators, for remote monitoring devices, which are, simple things like thermometers, and blood pressure devices are now, we have a shortage of them. And then pumps and injection devices, so that for patients in hospital, they can receive drugs, they can receive saline, right? So, urgent demand around that, and obviously supply chain gaps to fill that demand. But then that's got to be balanced with number two, which are the delays, for example, in elective surgical procedures, where we need devices to implant for, you think about orthopedics, spines, knees, hips, certain types of cardiovascular procedures that might be elective, even in diabetes. And so we're definitely seeing a slowdown in terms of those procedures, because right now they're obviously being canceled, and it remains to be seen when these procedures will be rescheduled. So those are sort of the two prongs of the supply chain impact, from a demand and then a delay perspective. So then we say to ourselves, well, what does this actually mean to the manufacturers? And, if you read some analyst report, there are basically four categories of med tech types of companies. And so I'll go through them now. First of all, you have the suppliers of medical products. These would be, sort of your more basic class 1 devices, like needles and injectors and syringes. So you think about companies like Becton Dickinson, Baxter, Dexcom, Insulet. And the projection is that some of these companies are actually seeing an increase in demand. So their recovery will probably be, about a 30-day period. They're somewhat buffered on the supply chain. So
you think a 30-day recovery period is what you're kind of recommending for some of these products and companies?
Yeah, I think that makes sense, at least from what we're seeing at this point, that you can expect about 30 days before sort of, normal demand comes back online and everybody's able to get the, requisite parts in order to continue manufacturing. So that's sort of at the minimalist impact, if you will. And then moving down the line to the next category, now we think about the companies that are manufacturing implantable devices. So now, again, we're talking about hips, knees, spines, cardiovascular, and companies like Medtronic and Stryker. These are the procedures that are being delayed or deferred. And so the projections are that these companies will likely see about a 60 to 90-day recovery period for things come back online and procedures are scheduled.
Yeah. So you're seeing quite a bit of variability in that kind of speed of recovery. And I think that kind of shape of the impact in terms of demand is really interesting. What I wanted to do, Lorraine, because we do have very limited time, is focus a little bit on the impact of the regulations and what we're seeing in terms of the broader short term and the urgent, rather than some of the longer term. So we can kind of condense into that area. That would be fabulous.
So if we go to kind of, theme number 2 then, and we can talk about the regulatory policy front. So we all are aware, or I guess most people are aware, that the FDA has relaxed policies and guidance on supplies and equipment needed during the crisis. So it's sort of an emergency authorization. In FDA language, they describe it, quote unquote, as enforcement discretion, meaning that they will not enforce certain regulation requirements in order to help ensure that the supply of ventilators and PPE, make it to where they're needed the most. The other thing that the FDA has said, though, is, normally the FDA requires pharmaceutical companies to let them know in advance when they're going to have supply chain shortages. That's not been the case in the device world, but they're definitely having a rethink of that, and now they are requiring that device companies let them know in advance where they're going to see these supply chain shortages.
What advice do you have, Lorraine, for companies that are, maybe can apply for this like relaxed standard? Like, where's the best place to go to get the latest information, or how are you advising companies to help navigate, as they think about this?
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of great information in the public domain, certainly on the FDA site. They have all of their guidance documents posted, but
Yep.
if you don't feel as though you can quite interpret them very easily,
Yeah.
there are a lot of fabulous publications, MedTech Insight and other
Yeah.
trade hubs that you can read that sort of break it into lay language, and
Great.
any number of consultants that one can just pick up the phone and get sort of a real fast download on exactly what does it mean to me, and how can you help me get introduced to America Makes, and things that can
And have you,
shortcuts.
and Lorraine, have you seen examples of companies that have hit this process and gone through this process? How easy is that, and how quick is that? Because the issue at the moment is getting product to market fast, isn't it? Everybody's trying to get product to market fast, but we need to get it to market in a way that's safe and secure and, fits in with whatever administration process is there.
Yeah, I think it depends on the need. We heard the other day that Jockey, the underwear company,
Yep.
has moved into making, surgical gowns.
Yeah.
So that's moving through, rather quickly. Obviously, on the ventilator front, we could touch on the Defense Production Act, but the reason that the president enacted that in particular was we're in a crisis situation, really wanted to work with General Motors and their capacity to manufacture ventilators to a large scale. That's not typically the way, medical technologies come through the pipe.
Yeah.
So I think that, where everybody is coming together to say there's a need and we want to smooth the pathway. And so I think we're definitely seeing that happen. In my career, probably, more than 25 years in this field, I've never seen things move as fast as they are.
Wow.
So there's definitely change. We might still feel a little slow to some people that are out of the technology world, but for the healthcare world, this is super fast.
Relatively speaking, we're in warp speed in the healthcare world right now.
Yes, we are. Yeah. And then, on even the legislative front has been interesting too, because both houses, the congressional body, the House and the Senate, are both looking at legislation. And this is interesting too, because it's quote unquote to break America's addiction to foreign medical supply.
Yeah.
So what they want to do is encourage U.S. supply chain redundancies. And they really want to be able to track that and have more contingency planning, more diversity in the supply chain, so that, the country doesn't find itself in the situation that it's been in currently. And then, finally, I think on the federal level has been the CARES Act, which passed on the 27th.
Yeah.
$3 trillion, lots of support packages for airlines, corporations, individual small businesses. But there's also funding in there for the FDA in order for them to accelerate medical device development and commercialization, and to actually develop a whole manufacturing system infrastructure, or to encourage the development of it again, to avoid these big sort of short outs, that we've been seeing the past couple of months.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see those trends. What I'm curious about, Lorraine, is whether you've seen examples of success where, are we seeing anybody stand up those ventilator manufacturing lines, and are we seeing a connection between supply and demand? Are we seeing, is there a tool by which companies can connect from demand all the way down to supply, and identify the right supplier, whether that's GM or whether that's a large contract manufacturer like a Jabil or a Flex? Mm-hmm. Are there successes occurring, or are we still in that process of defining the communication tools? Because obviously the timeline's moving increasingly quickly.
Yeah, so we're experiencing success, but I think it's very much in demand success and day by day success. And I don't think that it's systematized. I don't think it's scaled. I don't think that it's codified. I think that we're sort of in this, defensive mode, if you will. Yeah. And so I can't really say that I could point to a poster child of a where, you know, ventilators are getting there in a very, you know, fast and efficient and neat way. I think it's a little bit more like, wow, we have a need over here. Can we move something here and get it?
Yeah.
So can you, if you can't point to a poster child, and I know this is a tough one, can you point to the antagonist? Is there a particular barrier that's slowing down that process?
I think the barrier probably is, you know, you mentioned at the beginning, just being able to map out the supply chain and understand where the capacity is. I don't think there's good insight into that. And so I think it's going through all sorts of informal methods, you know, whether it's person to person or news conferences, or the word is getting out and people are coming to the fore to figure out how they can help. So to your point, I don't think we have the communication channels in place right now really to make it smooth. So I hope if we sort of chat again in another couple weeks, I'll be able to tell you that some things have settled in. But, right now it's probably the way it looks.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand that. I'm going to bring Greg Schulte in now, because I just want to get the whole panel going so we can get some debate, because I know Greg's got a lot of experience of standing products up. So Greg, thanks for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, Greg Schulte is the Director of Engineering at Mindtribe, which is part of Accenture. Give me a quick your 30-second bio, Greg, and then we'll get into what you're seeing in the market right now.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot for having me, Dave and Phil, and thanks for the insights, Lorraine. So as Phil mentioned, I help lead our hardware engineering capability at Accenture. Prior to that, I led that group at Mindtribe, which is product engineering consultancy in San Francisco. Obviously, we have a much larger reach now that we're part of Accenture, and so we're excited about that opportunity. We really have the full stack of hardware development capabilities, all the way from upfront industrial design and business strategy, all the way through to being able to move products into manufacturing. We work throughout all industries, but my specific background, of course, in medical devices. I started as an engineer at a large company at Medtronic, doing design for implantables, neurostimulation systems. I found myself going to progressively smaller companies where I felt like I could own more of the development process. And so that led me to a couple small startups, also in the neurostimulation space, that eventually were successful and exited and dabbled in medical ventures for a while, until I found myself to Mindtribe, and irony of all ironies, back at a 500,000 person company.
There you go.
Well, it must be such a journey, Greg. And you know, Mindtribe has such a phenomenal name across Silicon Valley as a leading, you know, product development firm. And so to have the expert on medical devices here to talk is just awesome. So thank you. I know one of the things that we have talked a lot about is this concept that Accenture is a very remote company, you know, as a whole, but building a hardware and doing product design in a completely remote fashion. These are untreaded waters, if you will. So maybe we can start there. Just tell us a little bit, how's your team coping with this? How are you guys still building product with, you know, all the shutdowns in the US?
Yeah, that's right. As you mentioned, Accenture actually is very good at remote working, but hardware development capability is relatively new to Accenture. And so we've had to make a lot of accommodations very quickly to be able to keep going on both of our existing projects and then the new projects that we're finding are coming to us because of this crisis. And one of those, or almost all of them, are related to having to work in disparate locations. So we've been able to set up, we've been fortunate enough that we have a shop technician who does a lot of our early stage prototyping. He has access to a very large space that's part of his home. And very early on, when we saw this coming, we moved much of our equipment to his house. So things like laser cutters and 3D printers and CNC machining. And now he's able to do a lot of that there and ship parts out to our team, which has really given us a pretty cool edge. Another thing that we've done is invest more heavily in equipment so that all of our team members can have access to things like 3D printers in their homes.
And what does a design review look like then? So you got this magical center in someone's home that's sending all these devices out into the world. And do you guys do like design reviews virtually, or, you know, as you're building a medical device and having to do this, like what does that process look like? What can other people do?
Yeah. So as you know, this is very new to us, just like it is to the rest of you, but it definitely involves the same thing we're doing here. A lot of, really, we don't shut off our Zoom or our Teams conferences.
Yeah.
We're at it all day long because that collaboration is so important. And not only that, the camera isn't always on our face. It's on our prototype. So a lot of funny camera angles as we maneuver to really show and demonstrate physical things to other team members.
Wow. Wow.
You
It's
guys
really,
use any
go ahead,
VR?
Phil.
You guys use any VR or AR to share products? Kind of share designs, or is that something that you see as a future solution?
I definitely see that as a future solution. We're working on VR projects right now, but ironically, we haven't used it as a collaboration tool. But I think it's inevitable, right?
Yeah, no, I see that coming. One of the things I wanted to do to bring Lorraine back in, Greg, from your point of view, are you having any experience in getting through those FDA regulations in terms of, getting products ready and approved and actually starting that process? And are you having bottlenecks? Is there something you'd like to ask Lorraine?
Yeah, a lot of the things that Lorraine mentioned really hit close to home. Certainly supply chain. So a large percentage of our hardware engineering team is actually working on a COVID-related project right now that's intended to, it's a device intended to disinfect critical areas from COVID contamination. So like hospital spaces and airplanes and nursing homes. And one of the things that we're seeing is that prior to the crisis, the device was manufactured in relatively small quantities, right? It's a fairly large piece of equipment, and we're talking something on the order of dozens each month, and suddenly surging now to thousands per month. So that doesn't just break down a supply chain, it creates the need to design brand new devices around the supply chain that's actually available.
And what does that look like when you say design around the supply chain? I know Lorraine talked about, these closures of different devices, but how do you think around designing around the supply chain with these constraints?
Yeah, so to speak generally, but I think this applies to the project that we're working on as well, speed is of critical importance. So it's really about, Dave, this in our community, we're always talking about MVP. It's really about MVP now, right? Yeah. What sort of extraneous features can we carve out? And then it's about, it's a little different than we normally operate because I think typically we're looking to drive a product forward through marketing and functional requirements. And now we're bringing supply chain in from the get-go and saying, you tell us what's available and we'll make sure that we accommodate the design to that so that we can meet speed. That's much more critical than cost or other typical factors at this point.
I'm sure, Lorraine, you've seen similar things as you think about the speed, right, of new products and maybe some of those features.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that you do have to think about what the available capacity is, and I think it makes you very creative and innovative. And obviously, we're looking at trying to source components from non-traditional suppliers, but that means that they might not follow the same spec or code, and then to the extent that you need to adjust other manufacturing parameters, how do you accommodate these components where you had everything sort of designed around a certain set of requirements or specs, and now those are changing, right? So I think we talk about this idea of agility and really being able to, I'm sure you're doing a lot of design on the fly around the capacity that you have to work with.
Yeah,
right. And outside of our design capability, I think you mentioned this before also, Lorraine, but there's been a call for us to help with really that matchmaking or connection effort between manufacturers who are looking for capacity or who are looking for suppliers or vendors. And then we're also finding a number of suppliers or vendors already in the medical device community, but who are making maybe parts and components for elective procedures are saying, hey, we're going to have to lay off or furlough workers. We have capacity, and we actually already, unlike before you go to GM, we have the knowledge of 13485 processes and things like that help match us together. And so, a good example of that, and in full disclosure, is actually my wife's company. Chamfer is a company that connects medical manufacturers with component suppliers. And they're putting together a tool because this is a huge need right now to play matchmaker between manufacturers who are looking for suppliers and suppliers who have the capability to help.
Yeah, creating
I think,
that whole marketplace. Fabulous.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And Greg, I think there's a huge factor there of bringing in multiple industries. I just wanted to say to the audience that, which I should have said at the top of the show, that if you've got questions to ask, go ahead and use the chat window or the Q&A window. We've got some stuff coming in, but we'd love to hear more from you. Greg, getting back to that, there's a lot of industries colliding here, and one of the industries that I think is interesting is the robotics market. That's seeing a lot of opportunity to assist at the moment. The idea of doing stuff more remotely, the idea of using drones to inspect particular areas, the idea of using, maybe robotics to do some of those cleaning processes where we can't get close to people or we shouldn't get close to people. Is that a big trend you're seeing? And I'll go to Greg first, but I think Lorraine, I'd like to know what you're seeing on that side of things.
Yeah, definitely, Phil. Even before the crisis, robotics has definitely been a growing field in medical device development. Our team actually worked on the original architecture and controller design for Auris Surgical, which was acquired by J&J last year, I believe, which is a robot for pulmonary endoscopy. So this is a space we're familiar with. And I think, when you combine robots with autonomy, that's really an interesting area, both for the future of medicine, as well as helping solve some of the crises associated with COVID.
Yeah, and I think that plays into that. This is a short-term response, but it's actually a good response that's going to have long-term value in the industry as well. Lorraine, do you see robotics playing a key role going forwards?
That's one area that's really just exploded even over the past week. Again, when you think about workflows in a healthcare setting or even in a home setting where now you can't use a human being because of social distancing, all of these other parameters, the ability to use the robot to deliver food, let's say, to the quarantine family. The Amazon, driver drives up, but the robot is actually the one that takes the package or the food to the door, because even that can be a source of contamination. And then also the idea of, this whole idea of social isolation, are there certain things that a robot can do that could make, for example, an older person feel some sense of connectedness, right? A human being can't do it. So I think from the perspective of working around the patient, and then other things that can be done in the hospital so that you can have reduced reliance on healthcare workers. So, if you think about in the Jacob Japhet Center in New York, they've had to stand up a makeshift hospital because there just is not enough capacity throughout New York City. They sent one of the naval ships into the harbor there in order to take the regular patients and be able to treat them. Like, that's how under capacity they are. And so you can imagine the ability to use robots in that kind of situation where you have limited capacity of healthcare resources. So, I think we've just got to get more creative about this. And I think once we do and we pass that tipping point, I think it'll be here to stay. I think we'll have the adoption that we need.
So 2 words for you there, Dave: creative and robotics. You do a lot in the robotics sector. You've got numerous customers in that. Are they getting creative right now? Are they coming to you with new ideas that they want to stand up really fast?
I think what we're seeing a lot is that there's a shortage of the number. If we just talk about healthcare, there's actually a shortage of the number of physicians due to the number of surgeries that are projected. And this is a trend that's being tracked pretty closely. So if you look at common procedures, an appendectomy or things that are relatively standard, there literally is not enough doctors to do all of these procedures as you look at the rate of population growth. And so this trend was already happening where we saw, like an Auris, a Verb Surgical, folks that were in the wake of a lot of what Da Vinci and Intuitive Surgical did. And if you say now in this post world of a global pandemic, where now we have so many more concerns around contact and spreading, we've never seen more requests, I think, for robotics in healthcare specifically. I think we think a lot about how do you enable innovation to happen there. And so I think from Lorraine's side, hearing what the FDA is doing at the government level and at Columbia, and how are our education institutes doing this, but then also at the product development level with Accenture and Mindtribe, we have to, it really takes many different brains and companies to help bring these types of solutions. So I think from a manufacturing, we see it in and out that we are helping be these guided experts to get people from idea all the way to launching a product. But it takes an entire community of experts, you know, like PD firms, like governments, like education, to bring solutions specifically in the healthcare sector.
Yeah, I know, Dave, you're fond of saying it takes a village.
It does take a village, or maybe a bunker. Either way.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those. Greg, from a point of view of product development, you talked about how you could do that remotely. There's an absolute need to do that, but the other need is to do that quickly. How are you ramping speed without taking critical stages out of a product development? Because these products are even more mission critical than other products you've developed. So they've got to be right, but you've still got to get R&D done much quicker than you would normally.
That's right. And so, you know, I wish I could tell you that there were magic bullets that made things go faster. The one that comes to mind immediately, just from an engineering standpoint, is leverage what you know, right? Leverage the parts that already work so that you're not building everything from scratch.
And maybe talk about that from your view. Like, do you help share like mechanical architecture, or are there software packages that you can help apply in different industries as an expert that Accenture is?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, it definitely requires an extra degree of integration across the hardware stack, right?
Yep.
Because it's not just, you know, one of the things that we found out in working, you know, with Accenture, now that we're part of a global company with engineering outposts in different cities and communities, that it's much more important for different engineering disciplines to be in the same place, right? Because you're speaking different languages. So a mechanical engineer, for example, in San Francisco can actually communicate pretty effectively with a mechanical engineer in Chicago.
Yep.
And it's really the cross-disciplinary communication that has become the challenge. And so that's where we're focusing, just to circle back to your question, that's where we're focusing extra effort, is making sure that cross-disciplinary communication is probably more than what it used to be in our life before COVID.
So having an electrical engineer, a mechanical, and a software engineer all co-located, this is a key recipe to being able to accelerate then.
Yeah, it's no secret that was part of you know, our agile magic before this, and now that we're not in the same place physically, it just requires an extra degree of communication between those disciplines.
Phil, have we talked about the need for communication in the bunker before and how important
that may have got mentioned. I think last week the big thing was make friends. You know, make friends, ask questions, ask for help whenever you need it. And I think that's absolutely fundamental. I was curious when you were talking about supply chain, about some of the tools that you might be using for that. If you're designing for supply chain, what tools are you able to access to find availability? And I'll ask Greg that, but also Lorraine, when you look at the supply chain almost at a component level for the healthcare industry, that's disrupted too.
Yeah, again, this is another benefit of being tapped into a company like Accenture. There's an existing supply chain team, both on the digital and physical side, that we can leverage. But outside of that, there are other tools. You know, I mentioned there are trade pubs and trade organizations in the medical device community that are great resources. Chamfr.com, CHAMFR. That's another one for procuring medical device components and supplies, and they're very well connected throughout the medical device supplier community as well.
And that's having real-time data, I guess. Lorraine, from your point of view, where's that kind of data available? And you need to know that stuff is, you know, is approved, fits the ISO standard, everything else.
Yeah, well, I guess, you know, the idea of, you know, what Greg said his wife is working on would really be interesting to follow up on, because I think that the ecosystem is very much designed around the individual manufacturers and the individual types of products. And so I think those people that are developing you know, hips and knees and orthotic products, or working at Medtronic, you know, they have their sort of knowledge management within inside the company about, you know, supply chain and where they get their parts. But I can't really say that I've seen any sort of universal ecosystem or, you know, network or something in the cloud where we're talking about now. You could sort of type in what your need is and it could, you know, scour the control center and help you to find the best part at the best price at the best time. I think that would be fabulous, and maybe that'll be an outgrowth of this. But right now, I think it's been, you know, it's who you know, it's who you've worked with, the trade pubs, it's going to the conferences. It's really not been anything that's been at scale. So tremendous opportunity.
And what do you, I'm curious on, for both of you, and maybe Lorraine, I'll start with yourself. What do you think some of the new products that will come out of this post-pandemic world, as you're thinking about the future, like what are the specific areas in healthcare that you think we should all be watching? And maybe Lorraine start, and Greg, I'm curious what you see for new products.
Well, you know, telemedicine is just exploding, as you know, right? So, and I think that's going to be a trend that's going to stay. We're seeing, you know, telemedicine, telehealth, also migrating into the clinical trials arena. So, you know, when you think about, you know, all of these companies need to do human studies in patients, and those have to go to centers. And if patients can't go to centers, then you have to use telehealth types of technologies in order to help conduct the trial, because otherwise you're going to slow things down. So I think that is here to stay. And then with that comes a whole digital wireless ecosystem, right, that fits around it, because now you need the wireless, you need the devices on the patient, they've got to track with the phone, they've got to talk to the doctor's laptop at the office. So I think that whole ecosystem around
monitoring and
the digital, the at home, the ability to monitor at home, you know, more diagnostics that can be you know, point diagnostics that can also be run from the home. So I think that's at least one pod of trend. We talked a lot about the robotics. I think we're going to see an explosion in terms of the application of robotics. I don't want them to take people's jobs that want jobs, but on the other hand, you know, again, if they can make workflows more efficient and just, you know, address the capacity shortage that we have in this country for health providers, I think that's positive.
That's
and
awesome.
if they can do jobs that are dangerous for people, that's important. One of the questions, or actually a couple of the questions and feedback we've had from the audience, is kind of just how many people, how many companies are working on medical devices now, and you know, you've already mentioned a few of those, and actually one of our audience mentioned they were working on a vital signs monitoring product. There's a lot of product development going on now, and some of it will be for the urgent and some of it will be for the post-COVID important stuff. Is there an idea of the scale out there? Is it just pretty much every R&D company has switched their efforts to this, or for some companies they're, you know, getting on with staying in their lane? What do you think, Greg? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think, well, it depends if it's an OEM or a manufacturer. It depends if it's a supplier. I think if, you know, there's capacity, there's a desire to help with COVID, especially if there's already existing knowledge and ability to help. I don't see a rapid switch over from core product, but definitely with any extra capacity, I think there's a possibility that medical device manufacturers will be getting into new areas that they haven't previously explored.
Yeah, Dave, you're kind of at this world of, you know, having hundreds of customers on one side and hundreds of manufacturing partners. What kind of shift are you able to monitor that? What kind of shift are you seeing in the mix of inquiries, in the mix of parts that get loaded?
Well, I can tell you that airlines are not growing very much, or travel right now. That's definitely a sector that's gone down. But I think there's definitely a hyper focus in this recession across the US in healthcare, because that's an industry we know will grow through this recession. You know, I think we saw similar trends in China as well, that robotics really has spiked in the last 2 months since they've come out of COVID. And so I think we'll probably see a similar thing across Europe and the United States as well. But I think similar to Greg, I think people are staying in their lanes, core product that people are really good at, they're continuing to build, and PPEs are relatively easy. I can go from making underwear to PPEs, or I think, was it Louis Vuitton or maybe it's Versace? So one of them was is now making gowns as well. Was it Versace?
Yeah.
Is that right?
I think Louis Vuitton started making antiseptic wipes, but I think what was interesting is some other perfume manufacturers were making cleanser. There's some fascinating switches there, but it's important to know where you're going. You can't just, if you're making something because it smells good, and then making something that's got to clean and protect from a virus being on a surface, that's a completely different thing. So there's a requirement, and Lorraine, that's kind of the job of the FDA and all those organizations. They've got to loosen these things to accelerate the process, but they've still got to take care of business and make sure things are done right. That must be a real, I think we're quick to criticize, but it must be a huge challenge for them.
Yes, it is. And, it's a real balancing act. And as you can imagine, even organizations like the FDA are under capacity right now.
Yeah.
To handle, all of the requests, questions that are coming their way, which is why they're part of this package, the CARES Act, in order to try to provide more resources for them to come up with more systematic ways of working, and to bring in the resources to help with this. So I do think that it's a real balancing act, and it's challenging everybody, I guess. The thing that is a takeaway for me in all of this, because I hear from companies literally every day, we're talking about all these anecdotes of companies that want to help, but there is just this tremendous spirit of wanting to help. I was called by a company today that's a silver manufacturer. Their silver goes into athletic wear, for example, right, to retard, perspiration odors. And they called me to say, is there some way that the silver could be helpful as an antimicrobe? And can you figure out where I could fit in this picture? So I'm just seeing that, across the board. And I think it's very inspiring that everybody is motivated to come together and help. And some of it'll stick and most of it won't. But
if the stuff that sticks good, you want to keep throwing it. You got to keep throwing it. And I think what you mentioned about resources is really interesting, because there is the opportunity to divert resources if there's good communication. We had a nice example here in Australia. Qantas laid off 20,000 people. Woolworths, who's one of the big supermarkets, were desperately short of people because shelves need stacking faster now. And they managed to get 10,000 CVs on the desk of the CEO of Woolworths within 24 hours. And within 48 hours, they'd recruited 2,000 people, and they were able to, start work and get stood up quickly. So if communication is there, stuff can work. It's, it's impressive when it does happen.
Yeah.
Lorraine, go ahead.
Airlines, actually the airlines have come forward as well. Obviously they don't have the passenger flights, but they are using their planes for cargo. Everything from transporting cell and gene therapy products, bone marrow cells, getting the ventilators, to the places that they need to be. So, business has to go on, right? Cancer patients have to receive their cells. And so I think they're helping to make sure that other parts of healthcare aren't interrupted, and that, patients who need care and acute and chronic conditions can continue to get the care they receive as well. So we're all focused on COVID and all of the ill patients, and that's the right place to be focused. But, we have the rest of the country that's still living day to day with the conditions that they had prior to COVID, and they need care and attention too.
Yeah. So Lorraine, you actually segued beautifully into our final segment, which is kind of key takeaways. What we like to do at the end of every bunker is give people a few key takeaways of, what they need to be thinking about, where they can get help. Last week I took first go and got all the good ones, so I'm not going to do that this week. I'm going to let Dave start, and then we'll go to Greg and Lorraine, and I'll come in at the end. So Dave, what do you think? What have you learned today? What are the key takeaways?
Yeah, I think, I'll start with what I stressed at the beginning, which is we can really look at a lot of the historical trends to see what we're going to see in the future. is one place. So the example I talked about with the tsunamis and earthquakes in Japan is a great thing for supply chain people to be studying right now. I think I learned a lot from Lorraine of just the impact of this demand curves with supply, that if it starts in one region and how it migrates, really we can track some of those things more closely. And Greg, I really appreciated what you shared, and communication is still key, cross-discipline. And I loved how you talked about that they speak different languages, even though they're still in English, and try making it more challenging when you speak different dialects as well. So those are some big takeaways. So thank you, Greg. Any big takeaways from you, Greg, or that you'd have people think about?
I would just say, I think we have challenge in front of us, but they're not insurmountable challenges. A really neat thing that I heard was that Medtronic open sourced their ventilator plans this week, right? But in order to crank out ventilators, it's like Phil and I were talking earlier. If an architect just gives you plans to a spec home, doesn't mean you have a home, right? Yeah. It's going to take companies that step up to play the role of contractor and to deliver the goods that it takes to build that thing. And I think those companies are out there. It's a matter of connecting them together. It's one of the things that we're working on. So adapt, I think, is a message. And there are still regulatory guidelines in place. We don't want to do more harm than benefit in our rush to get things to market. So let's not go rogue.
Cool.
Yeah, I think not going rogue is great advice. Lorraine, anything that you'd like to add?
I guess just, finally, I think we do need to systematize these changes and make sure that we do build them to scale. Because the fact of the matter is we are going to have the Southern Hemisphere going through this pandemic. Yeah. There is some concern that we're going to see a replay of the disease, next year. Hopefully we'll have a vaccine, but we may not be done with it. And some people believe that this is just a warm up for what could potentially be another pandemic in the future, and one that could be as, if not more, virulent. So yeah. I don't think that we should consider this a one-off. Yeah. We're talking very lightheartedly about the innovation, and some things will stick and some things won't. But we definitely need to build an infrastructure and an ecosystem to handle this brave new world to scale. So I just encourage us all to build with the future in mind.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for that. One of the things that I got was this idea of let's get creative, but actually adding to that, Greg's point, don't go rogue, I think is hugely important and hugely valuable. We need to get great design done, and we need to get it quickly. I love the idea of leveraging what you know already and who you know already, and I think that's hugely valuable. And one of my takeaways from Greg is that hardware can be done remotely. And when you think about all the equipment, that's really challenging. But some fantastic insights, and great to see what's going on and some real progress being made, and some great examples of companies actually stepping up and kind of doing the right thing and getting stuff to market and making sure stuff's available. So for me, that's huge. Thank you, Lorraine, so much for being part of this today. Greg, thank you again for your time. Really, really fantastic insight. And Dave, always an absolute pleasure to spend some time in the bunker.
We'll host together. Well, thank you everyone for joining the bunker. And the last thing I'll call out is that we've had so many questions. We've created a LinkedIn group online as well, so everyone can get together offline in between these shows and ask questions and share advice. So Greg, Lorraine, would love if you join as experts to that, and for anyone else that's watching too. So with that, be well, be safe, everyone, and we'll see you next time in the bunker.
Okay,
thanks a lot. See everybody soon. Take care, stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.